This is the Sierra-Cedar presentation for NERCOMP 2020, Finding the Value of PeopleSoft on AWS. My name is Tim Rogers. I'll be your presenter today. I'm the Director of Cloud Technology Solutions at Sierra-Cedar, focused on our managed services and hosting business. And I've been working with PeopleSoft for over 20 years. So I want to talk to you a little bit about why organizations are wanting to move PeopleSoft to the cloud. One of those potential items is to improve the overall labor efficiency of their workforce, improving labor efficiency through automation, improving labor efficiency by taking advantage of platform as a service services like the AWS relational database service. In general, reducing overall labor associated with managing and maintaining hardware in the data center, and also those every 3 or 4 year upgrade cycles that need to happen. So in essence, they want to get out of the data center business. For performance and reliability, you have the ability to create active architectures. So those are very easy to build out in the cloud compared to a traditional data center. Paying for what you consume. So in a traditional data center, again, you have to over provision your resources to get through those extended periods of time. Typically it's going to take you several weeks or months to build those out. In AWS, you already have everything that you need right there in front of you. So also along the lines of paying for what you consume. If you've got additional hardware needs above and beyond your baseline, right? So you have a short-term project or some urgent need that you need additional hardware for. Basically, with AWS, you just build out what you need when you need it, and then when you're done with it, you can delete it. So you're able to take advantage of the economies of scale that AWS offers. On the security front, cloud vendors like AWS have extensive third-party validations for global compliance, like HIPAA, SSA 18, and FISMA, and that'll help you achieve your security and compliance requirements for your cloud data center. Also along the lines of security, there's services that are available, like the AWS Systems Manager that can help you with patch deployment across your infrastructure. So enabling you to stay current on your security patches and updates and more easily and stay current. And then you also have business continuity and disaster recovery. So really that disaster recovery concept becomes more of an active high availability architecture where your environments, application and components and things like that are spread across multiple AWS availability zones, rather than your primary and secondary data centers like you have in a traditional environment. A primary and secondary data center from traditional is really becoming a thing of the past. So operational impact. So, again, once you decide to go to the cloud, there's a lot of different questions that you're going to have to figure out. The biggest one really is, how do I do what I'm doing in my traditional data center and doing it in the cloud? Do I use the same tools? Do I use different tools? How do I do backups and restores? So, most organizations that are in a traditional data center today have processes and tools, that have evolved over time. And then in most cases, they've been in place quite a while, right? So your teams are very comfortable with those processes. But, when you go to the cloud, while it is possible to manage your cloud infrastructure manually like you do in a traditional data center, why would you want to? Move to the cloud really should be seen as an opportunity to rethink and or reinvent how you manage and maintain your infrastructure with a focus on managing it more efficiently. So in order to do that, you're likely going to need a heavy dose of automation, also sometimes referred to as infrastructure as code. So auto scaling, right? So when you go to the cloud, another aspect of the value of the cloud is the ability to increase or decrease your infrastructure capacity when you need it. And again, paying only for what you need. So when you have increased needs, you're going to pay for the spike, and then when you're done with the spike, you're no longer paying for that extra capacity. So the AWS auto scaling service really provides two types of scaling capabilities for the PeopleSoft application. The first is the ability to auto scale the PeopleSoft application up or down, roughly 10% or so. To address small increases or decreases in kind of your typical run rate. The other approach, which is also part of the auto scaling service, is a scaling capability referred to as a scheduled scale. The reason why a scheduled scale is needed really is due to the limitations of the PeopleSoft application. It's got a caching architecture, right, which causes issues if you try to scale up too fast. So for enrollment events, student enrollment events, where you have large increases of students coming into your system, you'll execute a scheduled scale event, typically a few days prior to the event, to allow your PeopleSoft environment to cache out the needed objects and prepare for the large increase in consumption. Patching experience. So obviously, patching your PeopleSoft environment is always a challenge, and your goal is to minimize the amount of downtime associated with that patching process. So in the cloud, one way organizations are doing this is through a concept referred to as blue-green deployment, where your blue environment, right, is your current environment or the current patch level, and the green environment is really a clone of the blue environment. So that green environment is what you're going to apply the new patches to get your environment updated. And then once that's done, basically you're gonna bring the green environment online. You'll route all new traffic to the green environment, and then you'll start to drain the connections out of the blue environment. And once all the connections are drained from the blue environment, you'll shut down that blue environment. Now that blue environment, you're also going to hold on to for some period of time because it's also your fallback. So if something should happen and you need to restore back to the previous patch level, you'll go back to this blue environment and be able to get your environment or resolve the issue, very, very quickly, because it'll already be in a ready state to insert back into your environment if needed. So backup and recovery and disaster recovery. So in AWS, the concept of traditional disaster recovery has changed really to more of a high availability architecture approach, where the application components in AWS are running in multiple availability zones. So AWS availability zone is really a data center. So your environment would be running across multiple data centers simultaneously. So that's kind of the new way of doing things versus the traditional data center approach, where you have everything running in a primary data center, and then you have to fail everything over to the secondary data center, should something happen. And in most cases, that switch over to the secondary data center is very labor intensive. So really with this new approach, you're already running your PeopleSoft environment in multiple data centers to facilitate rapid recovery and maintain high availability. So another concept and value add of putting your PeopleSoft environment in AWS is the ability to enforce compliance and monitor the configurations of your environments. So in a lot of cases, you're going to have a baseline configuration and security requirements for your environment. There's going to be AWS services that will then monitor your baseline configuration to a quote unquote the known good state. And if there's deviations, in some cases those deviations can be remedied. So for instance, if you have certain ports that cannot be exposed to the internet, if something like that pops up as the deviation, then you can have those remedied right away. But if there's something that needs a little more investigation, then a workflow would then be triggered to then go over to the security administrator or system administrator to investigate that mismatch in more detail, to remedy the issue. So this is a much more proactive approach to configuration management in the cloud than it is, and it is not easily achieved in a traditional data center. So PeopleSoft environment. So in a traditional data center, most folks have experienced the build out of a new PeopleSoft environment taking days or weeks in most cases, usually associated with the number of touch points in an organization's environment to be able to build that out. In AWS, the process is much more streamlined, and you're really looking at a build process that's going to take minutes, or in some cases days. Typically the build process is very quick, but a lot of organizations have QA processes in place, where a QA needs to be done on the environment to make sure that it's ready and in a state that can be turned over to the end users for consumption. But again, a much different experience than what most organizations experience in a traditional data center. And then finally, cost controls, right? So cost controls with the cloud are always a pretty hot topic. Lots of discussion around, which way is the best way. And the reality is there's so many different options. Each organization really needs to look at what makes sense for them and what their needs are. So kind of a guideline, a solid compute cost control approach will include many different types of compute purchases, right? So for example, on-demand, AWS on-demand compute makes a lot of sense if you're going to be, looking at shorter term projects or during the migration process, right? Where your workloads and your workload requirements are not as predictable, or in some cases may be unknown. EC2 compute savings plans make a lot of sense. Once your production environment has stabilized and you have predictable long-term, workloads and a run rate established. So with EC2 compute savings plans, you're able to save roughly 66% off your typical on-demand rates, for a commit of around 1 or 3 years, I think is the typical term there. So it's a significant savings for a stable known entity, right? So you definitely want to take advantage of that savings capability. And then the other component really is auto scaling, right? So auto scaling should definitely be a part of your overall approach, to be able to grow and shrink your architecture as you need it, when needed. As a component of managing overall costs, right? So you don't want to have to go down the path of over provisioning your resources like you do in a traditional data center, and incur those additional costs when you don't need to. So that concludes my presentation. Hope I've given you a lot of things to think about as you plan your cloud journey and explore your different options. And if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to Jen Goldberg. Her contact information here is on this last slide. And I hope everybody has a great conference. Thanks.